The British Academy welcomes you to this live online event, part of the With Great Power season. This evening, House of Cards creator and author Michael Dobbs talks to Rana Mitter about his experience of the interplay between real and fictional politicians and political institutions. Michael Dobbs was with Margaret Thatcher when she took her first steps into Downing Street as Prime Minister, and he was there again with John Major when he was kicked out. Now he's a member of the House of Lords as Lord Dobbs of Wiley. His novel, House of Cards, was turned into a BAFTA-winning BBC television adaptation and, of course, transferred to the USA for Netflix Emmy Award-winning series. Join the discussion on Twitter using the Great Power hashtag and follow @Britac_news. Further details about this event are available at britac.ac.uk.
Sport. Fantastic.
Good evening. How are you all? Thank you for coming.
You'll just take over yourself, I think, Michael. No need for me to do anything at all. Nonetheless, I will greet everyone, if I may. It's a huge pleasure to see so many of you here this evening on a day when I suspect you probably couldn't have imagined that fact would far outdo fiction. And I don't want to delay too long before we get to the main event, but let me briefly introduce myself and then our guest a little less briefly tonight. My name's Rana Mitter. I'm Professor of Chinese History at Oxford and a Fellow at the British Academy, which is the UK's, well, we still have a UK, the UK's major institution for the study, research and promotion of humanities and social sciences. We have a huge variety of events going on day by day across the year here at the Academy. So if you enjoy what you see tonight, do check out our website, do check out the brochures and come and enjoy some more. But we are very privileged to have tonight possibly the single most penetrating analyst of events that have been unveiling before us through the lens of literature. He's, of course, our guest tonight, Michael Dobbs, Lord Dobbs, who has, according to his own website, never done a proper job, which I suspect is not remotely true. Nonetheless, the alternatives to the proper job have been remarkably interesting over the past few decades, Michael. You've been Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and worked alongside a whole variety of senior politicians, including, but by no means exclusively, Margaret Thatcher. You were Deputy Chairman, I think, of Saatchi & Saatchi, the advertising agency which is perhaps most associated with the Conservative ascendancy during the 1980s and 1990s. You actually have a doctorate from Harvard and Tufts on Chinese nuclear policy and strategic arms limitation, if I am correct. And
really use it on a daily basis. That was really useful to me in my career in advertising.
I have to say, since we're here at the British Academy, we might sort of switch. Should we talk about Chinese nuclear deterrence rather than House of Cards? Well, no, perhaps we won't take a referendum on that. It might go the wrong way. But you are also known for having written a few books, and one of those books, which I have, I think the original paperback edition, in fact, here from 1989, is, of course, House of Cards. Widely regarded, I think, as certainly one of the most gripping, but also one of the most insightful novels of British political life in the post-war era. It went on, of course, to become a legendary BBC television series starring Ian Richardson, the late Ian Richardson, late great, who's portrayed on the cover here, and of course has gone into all the great books of quotations, no doubt compiled by the British Academy's finest philologists, with that crucial phrase, "You might say that, I couldn't possibly comment," uttered, of course, by Francis Urquhart, your brilliantly villainous politician and Prime Minister who sits in not one but three of the books in the House of Cards trilogy. A whole variety of other books you've written, of course, including fictionalized version of the history of Winston Churchill during the 1930s and 40s. And during the course of today, we're going to range over a variety of your writings and how they relate to our wider understanding of politics. We have a good chunk of time before us. We'll be here until 7:30, and just in case any of you are getting too comfortable, bear in mind I'll be coming to you, the audience, on quite a regular basis during the course of our event here this evening. There'll be plenty of time to ask questions and debate and discuss viewpoints with Michael. So get your questions and your thoughts ready. But before we start the main event, could you please welcome our guest, Lord Michael Dobbs. Now, Michael, I think on a day like this, I can't do better than, if I may, to quote from page 40 of the paperback edition of, this is the British Academy, after all. We're into textual study here. And this is...
I feel like it's an exam already.
Yes, and afterwards, so we may have to make you do it again. At least I hope we get to do. So we have here, from this book published, more than 25 years ago, advice to an up-and-coming politician, possibly to Theresa May or possibly to Michael Gove, who knows. It says, don't be too intellectual, and don't look too successful. Don't be too liberal on social matters or too prominent on financial matters. And for God's sake, watch your back. Many more politicians have been betrayed by their colleagues than have ever been destroyed by their opponents. Remember it. Now, either we're going to have to change your name to Mystic Dobbs, or else there's something rather more universal than one particular storyline that comes from that quotation. In a sense, it's the cliche, but I have to say it. Today is the day when fiction has been outpaced by the reality of what's happened in politics. Do you look at it and think that, this is something that, as a novelist, gives you fantastic material to work with?
Today is the end of my literary career. How can I possibly beat that? Although, as I say, I've always said that political fiction is actually quite simple, really. I mean, what you do is you take reality and then you water it down. And you have to make it credible. I mean, if I put all this stuff into a book, you'd say, this is nonsense. I mean, Boris getting up and saying, no, I don't want it anymore. Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary. But it goes to the heart of what I've always believed is so important in political fiction. It's not about politics, it's about people. And that's what great drama is about. It's about people, it's character-driven. And, if I asked you if you'd seen season 2, say, or season 3 of Spacey's version of House of Cards, if you'd said yes, and then I asked you, okay, what was the bill that he was actually dealing with at the time? The vaguest idea, but you remember the characters, and that is what is important. And when all the histories will be written about what's been going on today in the last week or so, it won't be dealing with the issues, it'll be dealing with the emotions and the personalities.
I mean, one can't help but note that in his speech made just before midday today, Boris Johnson very explicitly and very pointedly quoted Julius Caesar. I mean, that is really a case of literature being pulled out to make a very real-world point.
Well, it's kind of what inspired me. I mean, Pete, I hope I'm not jumping ahead to too many of your questions.
No, please.
It goes right to the heart of how did I come up with House of Cards? It's very easy. When I was 13, I was sitting what was then called O-levels. And they gave me this book to read, Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. I thought, God's sake, this is so dull and boring. How am I going to deal with this? And then I read the story about the most powerful man on earth who's hacked and stabbed and chopped to death on the steps of his own capital by his best mates. And I thought this was fantastic. And it's a story which is eternal. You could have gone back to the ancient Greeks or the Egyptians before that. This is what has happened throughout history and throughout politics. So when people say, hang on, you wrote this and it's happened, it's come to pass. How did you know it was going to happen? I said, well, look, if they've been doing it for 3,000 years, there's a bigger chance they'll be doing it for the next 3. And it should come as no great surprise.
Absolutely. And while we will
but
come
all
back...
all the buses have come along at 1 today, which is
it's sort of, for a novelist, certainly, it's a sort of embarrassment of riches. Perhaps, should I ask you to comment on whether or not the other great Shakespearean comparison that's been made in the last 24 hours, which is with Mrs. Michael Gove, Sarah Vine as Lady Macbeth, is appropriate or not?
Infirm of purpose, give me the dagger, she said. Now, I'm sure that email leak was a simple slip of the finger.
Accidentally went in. Well, if her next Daily Mail column starts with, I've been washing my hands a lot, but somehow, they don't seem to get clean.
I mean, people have been texting me all day. It's been a mad day. They're saying, this is House of Cards. I said, no, actually, it's really more like Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad and everything sort of wrapped up together.
Well, look, we will talk much more about, obviously, contemporary events and also the way in which film, television, plays and novels, of course, have portrayed politics both here and abroad during the course of our conversation. But I'd like to start with House of Cards. As I say, none of us could have known that it was going to be quite as appropriate, although, again, perhaps we should have guessed on the grounds that the original television series back in 1990 was scheduled, as it turned out, during the week of Mrs. Thatcher's downfall, so it suggests that maybe having you around in town is not good for the health of Conservative politicians. But at the centre of that novel is Francis Urquhart. One assumes, but perhaps one should never assume, that he wasn't based on any one particular character, but he must have come to you as a sort of composite. How did the character of Francis Urquhart, the brilliant, plotting, villainous, aspirant Prime Minister, come into your mind?
You really want to know the truth?
We go for that round here.
Okay. Okay, look, I was a Thatcher.
You're not about to tell us that he's based on Geoffrey Howe. No.
I'll have to tell you a little story, because this is actually how it happened. I had no ambitions ever to be a novelist, and actually that modesty in the view of one or two of my critics was much deserved. But I was an aide to Maggie Thatcher. I was the first person to tell her on election night in 1979 at a count in Finchley that congratulations, Margaret, you've won. And I went on to become her chief of staff, and I was with her for many of those extraordinary years. And yet we had a huge falling out. A week before her final election campaign in 1987, she turned on me and, look, politics is rough and tough. What do they say? Politics is actually taken, the word itself is taken from the ancient Greek. You would recognize this. Poly meaning many, and ticks meaning tiny blood-sucking insects. And you never go into politics for a cut. It's always rough and tough, and often very unfair. And you have to put up with it. And I say that Maggie was. A week before that election, it was desperately unfair to me. And a lot of things that I've been thinking about and hoping for, absolutely out of the window. So a week later, 3 weeks later, I found myself on holiday for the first time in 2.5 years. And my wife, I was being very rude about the book that I was reading. And she turned around to me and she said, "Stop being so bloody pompous," she said. "If you think you can do any better, go and do it, but I haven't come away on our first holiday in 2.5 years to listen to you go on about this wretched book." And so, armed with encouragement like that, I go down to the swimming pool with a pad, a pencil, and a bottle of wine. And I'm in need of therapy, and I'm actually thinking about sort of looking for a new job. Margaret rather insisted on it.
And she could be forceful, I gather.
Yeah, yes, she's well known for her moments. And so literally there I was, and without too much colouring of the thing, I sat down and I said, "Can I write a book?" I'd had no ambitions to write a book, but I was going through lots and lots of things. I was bruised, I was battered, and I drank the bottle of wine, and by the time I'd finished that bottle of wine, all I had on my pad were 2 initials, F-U. And I don't know why, but there's something had stirred in me. I thought, I don't know what this is all about. And I'd never thought about this whole process, but I came back the following day with another bottle of wine. And F.U. became Francis Urquhart. That is why he is called Francis Urquhart, or Frank Underwood. And F.U. also became his character. And it's on the basis of that, and being beaten up, and many years of experience in politics. And politics is a rough, tough, and sometimes dirty game. Yeah. I just seem to find an outlet for my pain and turn it to positive effect.
I don't think I'm doing what they call a spoiler by revealing at this point. I suspect that most of... How many people in this room have read House of Cards, the original novel? Quite a few. How many saw the television series?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Large number. And how many have seen the American TV series that... Yeah, okay.
And how many really deep down know that books are always better than the TV series and you're going to rush out and buy it, right? There you go.
Yeah. Clearly so. Although you are executive producer on the American series, I believe, yes. Michael, so you get a look in each way. So, with all that in mind, I think it's not a spoiler to say that Francis Urquhart, first of all, frankly, is not a very nice man, if I may put it that way. And secondly, actually, by the end, is basically bumping people off. It's not necessarily left, right, and centre, but certainly on a reasonably kind of frequent, on what you might call a need-to-kill basis.
As John Major told me, he had done for his job what Dracula had done for babysitting. Yes.
That's about right.
Yeah.
How far, when you were writing it, was there a sort of desire to sort of take what you've seen, presumably backstabbing in a metaphorical rather than literal sense, in, you know, the height of Tory politics? Frankly, rather a difficult time, you know, the late 1980s into early 1990s, obviously a very turbulent period, quite unlike today when, you know, things are much calmer.
Yep.
You know, just sort of taking the metaphor and then making it more literal. Well, if, you know, they're kind of almost killing each other, let's make them kill each other. Was there a sort of extrapolation there?
No. I sat down there to have a bit of fun, to see what happened. I sat down every day and I had no idea what I was going to do, and it just came off the paper. And I actually sat down and I wrote it by hand. I had no plan. I had no chart. It was just something that I needed to go through at the time. And it turned out to be sort of reasonably successful. And then I thought, this is fun. Perhaps I should write another book. And I wrote another book that I'm desperately trying to have buried and nobody ever hears about again, because it was an awful. Because
that's the one where you basically have the king going up against another one.
No. There was something called. It was something about the Berlin Wall, and it was all about the Berlin Wall. And about 3 weeks before it was published, they pulled the ruddy thing down. So
not brilliant timing.
But it really wasn't a very good book, and writers often will tell you this, that the really difficult book is not the first one. That's sort of getting something out of your system that clearly has been there for some time. It's the second one, because that's the point where you've got to decide, if you're really going to do it seriously or not. And I had to decide on the basis of a book that, frankly, I wasn't that proud of, the second book. I'd either got to think about giving up this silly idea of writing, or actually taking it seriously and therefore giving up everything else, like my job. And it was one of those decisions which I stumbled through and felt inside, and I eventually decided, yes, I like this idea of writing, and I'm going to actually take the risk and see if I can make it work. But it was, the first book was not done on the basis that I thought I had anything to offer. It was to anybody else. I didn't even think that it was going to get finished when I started, let alone published. The point came, I'm sorry for any aspiring writers here, because this is of no consolation to you at all, but I was at a party conference as I was writing it with people that I'd been dealing with, journalists I'd been dealing with when I had been chief of staff. But instead of now on a formal basis, I was now on an informal basis, just talking with them and drinking with them. And one said, aren't you writing a book? And I said, no, I'm not writing the book that you think that I'm writing, because I have been asked to write the story of the swinging handbag. Getting rid of all of my angst about Maggie in an official revelation of everything. I just hate those sort of books. You share all those confidences and personal secrets for years, and then you go, at the first opportunity, you go and flog them all.
So just to be clear, there's going to be no Michael Dobbs memoir, then?
I didn't say that, did I?
An exclusive, ladies and gentlemen. You heard it here first.
No. But anyway, I said, no, I'm not writing that book. I'm just, funnily enough, working on a silly little novel. And he said, you've got to publish for it? No, I haven't even bothered to approach publishers. So a piece appears in the Times a couple of days later. Dobbs is writing this political novel and hasn't got a publisher. So the phone starts ringing. People calling me up, inviting me out for drinks, inviting me out for lunch and dinner. And I suddenly realised that I had to start taking this seriously. And I hadn't taken it seriously up to that point.
Well, one of the things that emerges over the course of the 3 books of the trilogy, and presumably after the success of House of Cards, you must have had in your mind that maybe going for a sequel would have been, a good thing to do. In the first book, he is, of course, the chief whip rather than the prime minister, and therefore perhaps it's indicative that in a sense, he doesn't really have any politics. I mean, he's a conservative, that's made fairly clear, but he doesn't really have policies other than killing cabinet colleagues who are inconvenient to him, which, again, is something that certain of our current day politicians might feel at the moment is appropriate, not to mention the leader of the opposition and his various colleagues as well. By the time we get to the second book, he does seem to have a sort of politics, and, forgive me if I've misread this, but it looks to me as if, without again giving too much of the plot away, he's portrayed as quite a right-wing Thatcherite, a strand of politics which, you're not a million miles away from working with Margaret Thatcher, and yet once again he's the murderous villain who comes a cropper off the back of this. I mean, were you trying to sort of act, as it were, against your own political inclinations when portraying him?
I was just having fun. I mean, it's possible to read too much into these things. I mean, you're absolutely right about Francis Urquhart in the first book. It's not about party politics. I mean, God, and that's one of the challenges with people, anybody who wants to write political novels or political drama, is actually to put your political prejudices to one side, or at least be aware of them, because people aren't interested in listening to you rant on about your political prejudices, and that's where so many of them go wrong. It was about a state of politics. I mean, you mentioned he has no views. You said he was a Tory. Yeah, well, yes, he was.
But you said he was a Tory, to be fair.
Because he had to be, because it was set in the time when the Tories had been in government for a decade or more. But it wasn't about politics. I mean, Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, they don't discuss policies. They don't say, well, he got this policy wrong. It's all about power. And that's what I wanted to concentrate on. But by the time the second book came out, I as an author, you have the ability to indulge yourself a little bit. And my first duty is to entertain. But if beyond that, you can actually start making people think about issues, that's an added value. And that's what I was trying to do in the second book, To Play the King, because the British monarchy and the system at that time, I thought was heading for very choppy waters. And I wanted to help illustrate what I thought was going wrong.
I mean, just through the course, those who don't remember, haven't seen it, essentially the story is about a king who one assumes perhaps is the heir to the throne to the current monarch, who puts forward policies that, again, without wishing to caricature, would sound more like sort of Tory wet policies rather than Tory dry. And this causes a sort of political dispute between him and the Prime Minister, Francis Urquhart.
It goes back a long way. I mean, you could. The very obvious example was Edward VIII when he was Prince of Wales. He went around the country saying something must be done, something must be done, and there was he caused a lot of some really severe political problems. But there were things that there was a new style of royal family going on with Di and Fergie, and it seemed to me to be losing its way a little bit, and I just wanted to explore some of those issues. Little did I know that once the book was published, it appeared as if half the royal family was going to go around auditioning for parts in the TV series, and all sorts of... It's ridiculous. I had in the book a princess who gets caught in flagrante on a beach with a man who's not her husband. And this was before Sarah's dalliance on the swimming pool, having her toes sucked.
Right. For those who perhaps don't remember this immensely historically important moment, one should say that I think it was the Duchess of York was at one point, I think, photographed with an inamorata with her toes being sucked. I can't believe I'm saying this in the British Academy. But anyway. Yes.
But those, ridiculously enough, those things are very important when you're talking about the reputation of a royal family. And I wanted to, I thought I took some liberties in that, but then they took even more in a way. But it does give an author an opportunity to say, look, here's a problem, and I want to explore it, and I want to explore it in fictional and dramatic terms.
I mean, in the last book in the trilogy, The Final Cut, you actually take what at the time actually had the potential to be a rather serious problem. Fortunately, perhaps one that's been relatively quiescent in recent years, which was the Cyprus partition. That's a serious issue, one way or another. I wondered whether at any point, you said it's a bit of fun, it's clearly huge fun, and they are about power in that sense, but by bringing more of these things in, is there also a sense of a debate even in your own mind about whether or not using techniques, I mean obviously not in real life, one assumes actually bumping people off, but sharp elbows, pushing hard, playing perhaps a bit beyond the edges of what people expect to get an outcome which politically you think is necessary and important is a justifiable thing to do?
Yes, in the sense that great leaders are all of them. They are uncomfortable people. They're not nice people.
Margaret Thatcher was not nice.
No, I don't think so. I think she was. She was. All great people are driven. They're obsessed. They have to be, because if they're like us and we want to go home and put the feet up by the fire and watch television, they're not actually going to do what they actually end up doing. And in order to become great leaders, and nothing is given this, but those who become great leaders do so because they go through times of great crisis, in which they change things. And in order to change things, you've first of all got to break down the existing system, and then build something new in its place. And in the process of breaking down these systems, you are going to make enemies. You are going to upset people. And you can only do that by being rough and tough. And let's face it, Maggie Thatcher was never loved by the electorate. But she was respected by the electorate, and that's a very different thing. And that's why she was elected and re-elected again. No, she wasn't I wouldn't dream of ever going around to, have tea with Maggie Thatcher. It's not the sort of person you'd want to be invited for tea with. But as a leader, that is a totally different matter. And this is one of the problems that we have. We elect people because we like them very often, But liking people and there being nice people doesn't necessarily, in fact, history will tell you, they probably will not make great leaders. So we have to find what the appropriate balance is between our thoughts that, you know, they're very nice people, but also there's a really tough, rough job to be done.
Under that definition of greatness, you know, the spikiness, the uncomfortableness, but actually someone who will get things done, are there any great politicians in British politics today?
You usually don't know until after the event that they were great. I mean, many of you will have seen the film The Iron Lady, which came out a couple of years ago.
Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep, beautiful portrayal, and I actually thought it was a fabulous film. One of my colleagues said, "Oh, it's a terrible film, I'm not going to watch it." Another one who did watch it said, "Do you know, it's absolutely awful. Didn't have a single mention of council house sales." You know, which I rather missed the point. It was a film. It wasn't a film
Maybe the
about
director's cut.
Yeah, it was a film about dementia and how even the most powerful people are, at the end of the day, are human, and all glory is transient. And that's what I got out of that, and with this beautiful portrayal by Meryl Streep of Margaret. It even happened to Margaret, and I think that the way that was done, that was 25 years after she had left office, been thrown out of office, with tears on her face. Who would have thought in 1983, 1984, 1985, that all those decades later, they would still be making films about her? So greatness is not something that is apparent at that time. Winston Churchill was not regarded as great at that time. In fact, he was loathed by many of his own party and derided by many more. Greatness is a judgment which history gives, and gives sparingly and rarely to extraordinary people.
I have to say, Michael, that was an extremely clever way of avoiding naming any politicians of the present day, which I take my hat off to. Do you think any of today's politicians have the potential for greatness?
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Touché. Touché. I think I asked.
Actually, you know, without getting too much into contemporary problems and challenges, but a lot of people now, and I've been focusing on this, Europe is certainly in the process of chaos and change, and the one person that keeps coming through this that might actually be able to help make the good things happen rather than the bad things happen is Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel could, in 4 or 5 years' time, be seen throughout Europe as being one of the great statesmen, if we manage to find our way through all this. And I don't think we can find our way through this without her participation. So I would say that you should put a few bob on that candidate.
A few euros.
Yes,
maybe they won't be around in a little while, you can say. I want to talk about lots of other things, Michael, during the course of the conversation, some of the ways in which you think about other people who've written about politics. Also, I'm sure we're going to get to Kevin Spacey at some point sooner rather than later, and some reflections perhaps more on politics widely beyond the UK as well. But I want to also make sure that we have a chance to bring in some questions and thoughts from our audience. And I'm sure there are many people here who have already been stimulated with various thoughts, comments, or questions for Michael. So could I see if there are any hands in the audience? And yes, right at the front. And would you please, as you put your question, tell us a little bit about who you are as well, and what you'd like to ask or what you'd like to say. Go ahead. Who are you, sir?
Thank you. I'm Zhang Jianhua. I am a journalist from China's Xinhua News Agency. I'm very curious about your research into the Chinese nuclear deterrent. But today I'm going to confine my questions to your writings. My first question is, in China, the 7-member Politburo is China's top governing body. At least 2 of them have mentioned or recommended your writings, actually. I'm referring to Chinese President Xi Jinping and China's top anti-corruption official Wang Qishan. It seems that your writings have not only reached out to the general public, but also have caught the attention of China's political elite. So my first question is, how do you personally see or interpret your popularity among the Chinese political elite? That is my first question, and my second question over a short
can we
one.
just stick with one question at a time, gentlemen? Thanks,
Yes.
thanks for that. Let's just get that. All right, well, okay, yeah, what's the other question?
The second one. Among the current world leaders, can you name 2 or 3 of them who have the biggest potential to be protagonists in a political thriller? Thank you.
You got that, Michael. Yeah.
The first question. I remember when I was, I think it was last September that I was over in the States, and President Xi had an official visit to the States, and I think he was in Seattle, and he said, I've been reading some reports in your American newspapers about politics in Beijing, and they're very critical of politics in Beijing. But I must tell you, he said, it is no house of cards. And I thought, yes. So a couple of months later, when he came over here on an official visit, and I had a chance to have a sort of slightly private meeting with him, I decided that I would mark the occasion by finding an original copy of the hardback version of House of Cards, almost 30 years old, and I dedicated it to him and handed it to him. And he looked at it, and he looked rather surprised. And there was a little furrowed brow, and he said, thank you, but you have House of Cards in this country too? But you see, it fascinates me. I mean, we could set House of Cards in Beijing very easily, because you look at the characters and the crises and those that come and those that go. I mean, it's not a dull time in Chinese politics right now. But what interests me much more is the fact that there are, I don't know, billions, I don't know how many, but millions of followers of House of Cards in China. And the fact that ordinary Chinese people are watching the same sort of thing, like House of Cards, and indeed Mr. Bean, which is another great favourite, I am told, in China. Things like that, as people on the other side of the world are watching in the different cultures, I think could be very important, because it establishes a sort of a cultural link that wasn't there before. And given that, some would forecast that it's quite possible that Chinese and Western politics could end up being sort of really rather stiff and difficult as the process of change around the world carries on. While it's stiff and difficult at a formal level, how very important those softer cultural links might be in just making sure that we remember that we still have a great deal in common, and possibly increasingly more in common than was the case 20, 40 years ago. So I actually, of course I'm delighted that it's a huge hit in China, but I think there are these cultural interchanges, those soft power things can be hugely important in the long term too, and that is why I'm always very happy. I spend a lot of time talking to Chinese media and everything else, because in my own little way, I'd love to foster that idea that we have lots that we can talk about and talk about very successfully.
Is there any truth, Michael, in the rumour that President Xi Jinping thought that House of Cards was a documentary?
Well, I have to tell you, Prime Minister Renzi of Italy was photographed going into a bookshop in Rome a little while ago and buying a copy of House of Cards. And I thought it appropriate to write to him and say, sir, I hope you realise that this is a work of entertainment and not a work of instruction.
If it'd got a copy of that and Machiavelli, then that would have been quite a nice, nice combination. You had a follow-up there, Jim?
Well, there was also a question about
world leaders, yeah?
World leaders. Wow. I'll put it this way: if I were a cheap journalist, a cheap novelist, or novelist without too many ideas, I would think that Donald Trump would make sort of quite good novelistic material. But what I would do with him, goodness only knows. But he's certainly different. There are Jerry Corbyn, for instance, is you see, I'm going to the characters, not necessarily their power, and not necessarily their abilities, but their colour of their personalities. And for a novelist, it's the colour of the personalities that is really so important, rather than the fact that, I mean, Angela Merkel, I mentioned Angela Merkel, and I suggested that she could be one of the great Europeans of the 21st century. She could be turned into a character in a novel, but it would take more work and a much greater depth than if I were a cheap novelist working with somebody like Donald Trump.
We should probably ask the representative of China's news agency, Jianhua, do you know who writes President Xi Jinping's jokes? That's a state secret, probably. Well, we'll have to find out. We had a question over there, I think. Yep, go ahead. Tell us who you are and what your question is.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I just finished high school. I begin at Oxford next year studying English. So my question is relatively intertextual, if you don't mind.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you, so I'll have to get Rana to...
Absolutely, just speak to the mic.
Sorry, this is better. You've mentioned the word entertainer twice. I wanted to ask you about your own personal role. Do you view yourself as an entertainer or as an investigator into what is basically a kind of the extreme potential of evil, one that kind of puts you among the ranks of Tacitus with Sejanus and Shakespeare with the Machiavellian libertines around Elizabeth? What do you kind of view as your own role?
Was that clear?
You'll forgive me, I have to ask Rana to give it again because you're on my bad ear. This is gone.
Sorry.
I call it a war wound.
Would you like me to repeat?
No,
is this better?
This is not old age.
It's fine.
This is a war wound.
I'll just repeat it for the audience as well. That's fine. No, very, very good and clear question. You mentioned you've described yourself as an entertainer more than once. Certainly that. But would you call yourself primarily that, or would you also see yourself as an investigator into evil? I think was the phrase that you used there. Daniel.
That's a fascinating question, if I may say so. Because, look, I am an entertainer, but hopefully, as an entertainer, and I've been hugely privileged. Look, I stumbled into the world of writing 30 years ago, and by hook and by crook and by chance, I've been able to raise my family. And it's a job. It raises my family. That's why I do it. If I couldn't keep my family on it, I would have stopped. But to be able to do that, and learn the job and get better, as I think I have, got better at the job as I've been doing it, is a huge privilege. And it's an opportunity to actually improve yourself on the job that sometimes isn't always there today. So one of the things that people are constantly asking me is, why do I always write about dark characters, evil characters? Remember, this is drama, not documentary. I'm not suggesting that this is politics, but I am suggesting that it is potentially part of politics in just the same way as Shakespeare did. And I'm not comparing myself to Shakespeare. I'm just saying that dramatists throughout the ages have concentrated on those darker parts that lie within us, because it's when we're under stress, when we're in a crisis, that we retreat into those dark parts, and that decides what sort of person often we are, how we act in a crisis, and often how we act inappropriately. And in politics is a wonderful opportunity for that, because in many cases, politicians have a choice in front of them, and it's not a choice between good and bad, it's often a choice between different types of bad. And you have to take this appalling decision of, how can I do the least damage? And so I think it's entirely appropriate to look at the dark side of politics and of political characters. The other half of my life is going around trying to protest that we politicians really are, by and large, quite decent people trying to do a very difficult job to the best of our skills. But I have to tell you that most people appear to be interested in the dark side, and it pays me much better than the bright side. But do I, people ask me, aren't you undermining politics, the whole political system, by writing about wicked characters like Urquhart? I simply answer that I think politicians actually have the main role in deciding what their reputation is out there. And I'm trying to illustrate human nature more than politics. And I could set it in any other circumstance. I could set it on a university campus, for instance. There is nowhere on the planet where politics gets more wicked and more vicious than on a university campus. Am I right, Rana?
Absolutely true.
Yes.
I haven't killed anyone since last week, though.
Yes. I did suggest to John Major in his really difficult days as Prime Minister that he should perhaps hold his press conferences on the rooftop of the House of Commons, which might keep the journalists under a little bit of control. But it's something I worry about, in the sense that I don't want to portray all politicians as being wicked and evil. But on the other hand, I can't go around pretending that they're all wonderful and everything is sweet in the stable. It's not. And so I hope that most people can accept that it is fiction, not fact, and it is meant to illustrate a point, not actually to be an example of the way that politics should be or indeed is.
Let's take one more in this section. We'll come back for more questions, so don't worry, there are plenty of other chances. I'm going to do a bit of, I'm going to break Tory principles on your behalf, Michael, and try and do a bit of gender discrimination if I can. Are there any non-male people who would like to ask a question? No? Okay, well, in that case, all right, back at the back there. Yeah.
Hello. For my sins, I've read 350 politicians' novels as part of my research. I'm not sure how many of your rivals or predecessors' works you've read, but do you see an evolution in the kinds of purpose of these things? And of the other politician novelists you know, do you get a sense of their motivations?
Sorry,
interesting. Well, I think the key, very interesting question, of other politician novelists that you know, and I assume you all hang out together in a club on a regular basis and swap stories, do you see a change in the way that their motivations have, sort of come out over the period they've been writing?
Novelists are perhaps the most isolated individuals on the planet. We don't have clubs that we go to. We don't spend our spare time sort of knocking around each other. Actually, if we do spend our time outside of our garrets, we're out there with real people learning from them, because they are our subject matter. And one of the wonderful things about being a writer and falling into this system of being a writer is that since I decided to become a writer, in order to be a writer, you're an observer. And there hasn't been a single moment of my life since I started writing when I've been bored. I could be delayed in an airport for 20 hours, and I will still find a huge number of things to occupy myself with, even if it's just people watching. I'm not just people watching, I'm learning from them, I'm inventing things. So it's a wonderful way to engage your mind. Of course, political authors meet on a circuit, and occasionally you bump into each other. I was with Julian Fellows this afternoon, so he was showing guests around. I mean, it's wonderful to have somebody alongside you who knows some of the intimate details of your own craft.
Do you have to be in the House of Lords to be a politician novelist, or is it just helpful?
It often pays to get thrown out of the House of Commons in the first place, because that gives you the opportunity to do things. I mean, who are the political novelists that people will have heard of at the moment? Geoffrey Archer, Edwina Currie. Who else is there?
I think Julian Critchley back in the day, I suppose.
Julian Critchley.
Giles Brandreth, although he was sort of in and out in a sense.
Yes, he doesn't really write fiction.
I suppose not.
And Anne Widdecombe, of course.
Yes, that's true.
Although she doesn't really write about
fiction.
Yes, doesn't. So, actually, I've got
Douglas
a huge
Hurd,
book.
Of course, back in the days.
Yes, with the help of somebody else, always co-wrote it. He wrote many books. I've got a shelf, actually 2 or 3 shelves, of political authors going back 50, 60 years. Maurice Edelman, for instance, was a politician who wrote, a Labour politician, who wrote some very, very fine books, one of which is still in print, called The Minister, and it's really well worthwhile looking at.
And Wilfred Feinberg.
Wilfred Feinberg. Politicians had more time in those days. Macmillan used to sit as Prime Minister in his garden at number 10 and read novels. And
he said he always liked to go to bed with a trollop, didn't he?
Yes.
Something like that, anyway.
Winston Churchill actually once wrote a novel. It's not a very good one, I must say. But,
Savonarola.
Yes. But where was I coming to? I mean, coming back to the point that these shelves, it's remarkable for the number of political authors who have written 1 or 2 books. Those of us who have managed to make it into a career, if you like, or more than just an occasional distraction, are few and far between. And the reason for that is that actually writing, in order to write a book, you've really got to know something about what it is you're writing about. And politicians, particularly nowadays, have an appalling life in terms of pressure and timetables. They don't have the time to write properly. And to write properly, it's not something you scribble off while you're on a bus or on the back of a train. I think it's quite a serious job. So you either don't have the time, or you don't have the real political depth which enables you to make politics in Westminster come to life. So I think that's why a lot of people try it as a bit of an entertainment. Very few actually go into if I say the grown-up version. But I have to say that when it's done well, either in book form or in television form, it can be spectacularly entertaining because it's such a colourful background to use.
Two things to mention. I think this is a nice way to get back into the conversation and start talking a bit more about that wider set of influences on politics. One is just since you brought up Winston Churchill, and we'll come back to him again in a moment. He's part of a select group of rather unlikely people who've indeed only ever written one novel. He wrote a novel called Savonarola, which you say is not very good and not read. It's not, however, as bad as Mussolini's only novel, The Cardinal's Mistress, which is a real kind of potboiler.
The research must have been exhausting.
And actually rather better than you might expect, indeed so, personally on the job, no doubt. And rather better than you might expect is the one novel by 1930s screen siren Jean Harlow, who actually wrote a sort of sub-Scott Fitzgerald novel called Today is Tonight, about the roaring jazz age. So there you have it. What I was thinking as you were speaking about that question of politicians, House of Lords, House of Commons, there is, of course, one person, we don't necessarily tend to think of him as a politician, but he was very much in the Lords and a minister, and that's C.P. Snow, a name who actually is not so much heard these days, but, back in his time, was both a bestseller and someone who actually, was writing in a serious way about politics as politics. I actually found myself the other day reading, again, a novel with a rather unlikely theme in a sense. It's called The Corridors of Power, which of course these days is a cliche, but Snow rather apologetically said, well, at least it's a cliche that I invented, which he felt rather miffed that it had sort of become in common currency, or at least possibly he felt that, but he couldn't possibly comment. The story is actually about a Tory minister in a Macmillan-style government who's actually in favour of nuclear disarmament but can't admit it, which is, again, it gets that question of a political dilemma in that sense. When you get to that, you end up thinking also about other people who thought seriously about politics as politics while bringing it out through character. I mean, Trollope I mentioned briefly, and of course he writes a whole series of political novels. Were any of those sorts of writers the ones who were out to entertain, but also, I think, were more thinking about the politicians in their own right, rather than necessarily as vehicles for a portrayal of power, as you wrote and as you considered sort of the political novel more broadly?
No, I think that's, they're wonderful books, and Corridors of Power, again, that's one of the books on my shelf. I should, by the way, remember Chris Mullin. Chris Mullin has written a couple of very good, and made a beautiful, fantastic television series too. And
it's about when Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, isn't it?
Yes, it's. I'm looking forward to seeing Chris's take on all of this. But the. It is wonderful to be able to have that privilege. I'm thinking of a book of my own that I wrote some time ago called The Lord's Day. It sounded very silly at the time, but I thought, hang on, this is long before I became a member of the House of Lords, but there's a day every year which we have the state opening of Parliament, where the Queen comes and the royal family comes, and in the House of Lords you've got all the judges, you've got all the ambassadors, the government comes, the opposition comes, all crowded into one room. And I thought, hang on, they're all crowded into one room. What fun can we have with this? So I locked the doors and I held them hostage. Now, as I was researching this book, which I thought was silly, it all started because behind that wonderful gilded canopy where the throne is in the House of Lords, this beautiful piece of Victoriana, you actually find two doors embedded in the side. And unless you're actually looking for them, it's very difficult to see, but there are two doors. And I remember when I was shown those doors, and I said to my host at the time, I said, what's behind those doors? And he said, what do you think's behind those doors? And I said, well, look, they're right behind the throne. There must be But there might be a communication centre, perhaps, or an escape tunnel, or this is where the security is taken care of. And he said, OK, open the door. And I said, I can open the door? And he said, yes. And it opened with a satisfying Victorian creak. And there, behind this door, in this room, right behind the throne, were mops and buckets and bags of waste. It's where Mrs. Mops keep all of their doings. I was so taken by this, I thought one day I must write a book about this. And the book turned out to be the Lord's Day, when I held the state opening of Parliament hostage. Outrageous idea. And I started researching it entirely from public sources. And I began to get very worried. Because you know what happens in this country. I mean, nobody had had a go at the place since Guy Fawkes. And because nobody had bothered to have a go at the place, nobody had bothered to rethink the security around the place. And I found this, Guy Fawkes, you've heard of him? Apparently the only man to ever enter the House of Lords with an honest intent. So I'm researching this book, and I'm getting very worried about what I'm discovering. The security isn't really what it should be. And if I can discover it, anybody can discover it. So I wrote to the Home Secretary. And I said, look, I'm really worried about some of these things that I've discovered, and perhaps somebody could come and have a word with me so that I can explain this. And I waited and I waited and I waited, and nothing happened. I didn't even get a letter of acknowledgement, let alone a response. Quite clearly, I went straight onto the nutters pile. And they have a pile for people like me who write difficult letters. So I was now another 3 or 4 months into the project and getting near to finishing it. I thought, well, I've got to do something. So I wrote to Blackrod, I wrote to the Sergeant at Arms, and I wrote to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Pretty similar letters. And I said, look, this is what I've written, and I sent them some early copies of the book. Please pay some attention, because I'm getting increasingly worried. Nothing happened. And I thought, well, what do I do about this? So I published the book. And then all hell broke loose. Literally, I was taken aside by the security service and said, this is outrageous. And I said, yes, it is outrageous. And they said, this is absolutely appalling. And I said, yes, I agree. It's absolutely appalling. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, I think it's outrageous and absolutely appalling that I have been trying to let the system know, warn the system for months and months and months about what I regard as being the security failings here, and nothing's been done about it. So they said, what did you do? And I said, I wrote to the Home Secretary in the first place, and I showed them a copy of the letter that I'd sent. And their faces flushed with relief, because it was no longer their fault. And we went through a few unhappy meetings and hours when I explained to them, I said, look, you know, I haven't let any secrets out, because I've got this all from public sources, and this is what you should realise. And you should tighten up on the security measures. And they got the point. And a couple of weeks later, they called me up and said, you know, come to lunch, will you? And I thought, well, as long as it's not on a yacht that is sailing out into the North Sea.
Never to be seen again. Yes.
So they took me out to lunch and said, they apologised. They said, we're sorry. We got off on the wrong tack, and we didn't understand the situation behind this. And we now understand, and thank you very much. And of course, we will be making adjustments to our security in light of this. And they looked at me and they said, and have you got anything else to tell us? So you can use your books to, I mean, in my case, it was a security matter. In C.P. Snow's case, it was all about nuclear disarmament. And there are plenty of other examples. In another book, I talked, as I say, I was worried about the future of the royal family. And it does give you an opportunity to entertain and advise and inform. But if you don't entertain in the first place, nobody's going to get the other bits.
I know that you've had a political career which stretches over decades, and indeed, you know, you're still active today. But if I may say so, there is a particular association with the 1980s, a moment which now has, I think, and it's terrifying for those of us who remember it, but it's now slipped into the era of contemporary history, you might say that, the Thatcher era, the late Cold War. How many people here remember the 1980s? Come on, don't lie. Quite a few of you. Okay.
I was in advertising in the 1980s, and I can remember nothing.
Quite so. You have a character called Roger O'Neill who doesn't remember very much in House of Cards, I think, Michael, but I'm sure that's quite different sorts of reasons. What I want to ask, though, is politics in the 1980s was confrontational, certainly within Britain in all sorts of ways, in a way that probably wasn't as true of, let's say, the 1990s. It seems to me, in a sense, it would be harder to write whether it's a thriller or even a very contemplative novel about the era of John Major in that sense. Nothing against John Major, but it was a different time. When you look at the way in which other people wrote the 1980s and its politics, how do you feel it's been portrayed accurately? I'm thinking here about John Mortimer, a left-wing novelist and playwright who wrote a Conservative cabinet minister called Leslie Titmuss, who was portrayed also on television, several series, Paradise Regained, and quite a sympathetic portrait as well. Alan Hollinghurst, Booker Prize-winning novelist, The Folding Star, in which, again, a Conservative MP plays quite a prominent role. It is a decade which novelist Jonathan Coe, What a Carve Up, a very savage attack on the 80s. It's a novel whose politics it's a decade whose politics come back over and over again. Do you think it's dealt with fairly?
Well, what's fair? I mean, politics should be about values, about passion. It's about things that you believe in fundamentally and are willing to take risks for, and if necessary, possibly at times even die for.
Let me explain what I mean by fair in that case. Let me use an example actually from television rather than novel in this case. You'll know, and it's a case that many people will be aware of, that in the early 1980s, shortly after the Falklands conflict, 2 television plays were commissioned by the BBC. One was a play by the great playwright and television writer Charles Wood called Tumbledown, which was not exactly an attack, but certainly a sceptical look at the Falklands conflict, and it was a very impressive and powerful piece of television. Another play was commissioned, just called The Falklands Play, from a playwright called Ian Curtis, which took a view that was more sympathetic to the then Conservative government and of Margaret Thatcher, and for all sorts of reasons, that play didn't make it onto the air until more than 20 years later, I think. That's a rather sort of crude example of the wider point, which is, you come from a particular viewpoint. It is politically the dominant and victorious viewpoint of the 1980s. Is it reflected fairly or accurately or sufficiently in the culture of that period?
I don't think that we should be setting out to do things fairly in a creative sense. It is not my duty to be fair to politics or fair to the people that I write about. It is not my duty to balance everything when I'm writing. And the arts tend to be largely sympathetic to the left-wing side of the argument, and the hard-nutted bastards like me tend to be on the other end of the bastards, and there's a small minority. As I say, when I was recently dealing with an outburst of anti-government, anti-Tory propaganda from one of my colleagues who's in the arts business, I said, from a red carpet on a clear day, it's possible to see almost as far as the waiting limousine. And it's a frustration of mine that there are so many people in the arts who have such clear political perspectives and such deep political understanding, having played a role in some Shakespeare play or other at some time, that they express it not only very vehemently but very inflexibly. And I think actually because I'm an active politician, always know that there's somebody who's got a different opinion from me, and there's always a chance they might either be right or have something to offer. But that is not what we tend to do in a cultural sense. But I don't complain about the fact that they're not being fair, because it is not their job. It is not the job of an artist to be fair. It's to express as best as they can what is inside them and let the general public take their own view of it.
Is there a novel or a film or a television series either from the 1980s or about the 1980s in Britain, about its politics, that comes from the right that you think is a lasting and worthwhile work of art?
I mean, it's always very difficult to say from the right, because there are very few of us on that side of the spectrum.
But I mean, it's not as if anyone's preventing right-wing people from writing novels, and, I mean, one might argue that there are certainly certain sorts of politicians who argue in their cups that the BBC is sort of actively preventing right-wing writers coming out there, but it's not really that, is it?
I'm not even getting close to even getting near that sort of argument. Ian Curtis, for instance, did have a strong argument with the BBC, saying that he was being prevented from getting his play on air simply because of the anti-government and anti-Tory instincts of the BBC. That was his argument, and it's not an argument that I want to...
No, I'm not suggesting you're participating in that at all. It's really more a question about creative production. The 1980s, as I say, is an era which, because it's contemporary history, we now have some perspective on, and it's very present in all these people who win Booker Prizes, produce television series that, are considered, generally, I think, accurately to be impressive in one way or another. We think back of the Voice of the Black stuff, perhaps, the whole Anna Bleasdale. It seems to me, maybe it's to do with protest. Perhaps it's because the politics of the right doesn't encompass the kind of conflicts or clashes that enable that kind of artwork to be produced.
I mean, there are many different ways of analysing it. You could say that it's because creative people are often led by their hearts, and left-wing politics are often sort of very compassionate. And
but you're very passionate about your politics. You felt very strongly about.
Yes, I am, and I'm a writer. But I could also find you many other people who are very much more clinical about their approach to politics on the right. Is it something head and heart, and the fact that you need the heart if you're going to go off and be successful in the creative world, while if you're led by your head, you might go off into other worlds and do great things. I'm sure it's not as simple as that, but there is clearly, and there is all the way around the world, a stronger tendency for people on the left of centre to get involved in the arts than on the right of centre. And what's the point of complaining about it? It's a fact of life. Get on with it, and let let ordinary people make up their own minds. I wish there were more on the right. I mean, I did write a book about the European Union several years ago, when I thought that it was heading into deeper and darker territory. It may still be a great bestseller.
Its moment may have come, Michael.
Its moment may have come, but in all honesty, I mean, I don't sit here thinking, my God, there's this whole creative world out there, and I must play a part in it, and I must change that world in order, towards my perspective. I sit there saying, look, I've got a job to do. I've got a family to raise. I've got kids to feed, and as long as I can do that, that for me is as much as I want to do. If I can do anything else beyond that, that is great. But that is my first and foremost duty. And for me, it may sound horribly callous and uncreative, but first and foremost, for me, it is a job. And it's a job. If I can do it well and get remunerated, that's fine. But if I fell flat on my face, and my books fell flat on their face, and my work fell flat on its face, I'd go off and find myself a proper job.
Well, I don't know if the phrase, "it's just a job," is a phrase that's ever been used by Frank Underwood, the American president in the American version of House of Cards. But maybe we should just turn to that for a few minutes, because many people, of course, will know your work primarily and first of all through the House of Cards Netflix series. And I think the first major series to win significant numbers of awards through an internet-only portal in the first place, which of course is yet another sign of the changing times. I would note that, if I have it right, in the American version, of course, the political stage has been switched, and Frank Underwood is in fact a Democrat rather than a Republican, possibly because even you couldn't imagine someone as wild as Donald Trump, so you had to stick with someone who was vaguely plausible in terms of a presidential candidate. When you turned to, and you're executive producer, obviously you have a lot of input on the scripts. When you turned to the American story, did you find yourself thinking, I'm playing the big stage now, this is where the real narrative happens, this is where the real politics happens, it's different from the small enclosed world of Britain?
No, because I think that politics is still about people, and whether you happen to be in politics in Britain or Russia or China or America, you are there for that same strange mixture of reasons. You're there because you want to change the world, because you want to make things better, but you're also there, inevitably, for your personal ambition, and there's nothing wrong with personal ambition. You could not have politics without personal ambition, and that therefore means power, and it's that age-old, timeless conflict which every politician has. Politics is a team game. It's a bit like football. You know, you have to be part of a team, you have to play in certain positions, do what the coach says, you have to pass the ball from time to time, you cannot score every goal yourself. And politics is a team game too, which means you have to compromise. And you inevitably will find yourself in politics doing things, saying things, supporting things that you don't actually believe in, because you have to do it for the team. Because the alternative is to be a prophet in the wilderness, shouting out the sincerity and the purity of your opinions to no one. It's getting your hand on those levers of power which makes the difference between just being a person with strong views and actually being able to do something about them. And it's in that process of getting your hands on those levers of power that you have to make all these compromises and, in many cases, just go too far. And every politician will have their own line in the sand. I will go this far, but no further. And some lines in the sand are very much further away than others. But it's every single politician everywhere I know has this same internal dilemma. And for instance, just as a means of illustrating it, recently I saw a version of Julius Caesar set in contemporary black Africa, and it worked wonderfully well. You know, you could almost blink and forget that it actually came from all those centuries ago.
Let's, in that case, think about character, and Francis Urquhart, Frank Underwood, two, in some ways similar, but also in many ways very distinct characters, who have been played very memorably. First of all, Ian Richardson, of course, BBC 20 years ago, and currently Kevin Spacey for the Netflix version. How much of the drawing up of those characters as portrayed on screen is you? How much is the actors? How much is there a kind of synergy in creating those very memorable three-dimensional screen presences?
In the American version, we have an extraordinary system. We're producing 13 episodes a year, and 13 episodes that are produced to the highest possible standard. I mean, these are the techniques of Hollywood's brought to the smaller screen. And that requires, it requires a huge effort and a huge team. We have, typically on any series, we will have perhaps 6 different writers working on it, 6 different episodes with a showrunner who's making sure that the story arc is kept intact and it all feeds nicely into one another, so you can't, when you're watching it, you cannot notice the scenes. So it's all done on a huge warehouse on an industrial estate outside of Baltimore. Everything that you pretty much see on an inside basis in House of Cards is shot in this warehouse. And the sets are extraordinary in their terms of their accuracy, to the point that we have people from the White House coming, and Congress coming to look at the set to say, my God, is it really that good? It is slightly inaccurate because our Oval Office is actually slightly larger than the real Oval Office in order to get the cameras in and out. But the attention to detail is astonishing, even down to researching the light switches or the cornicing. We will source exact replicas, and if we can't, we've actually got a little manufacturing system where we will make those exact replicas. I mean, it's a wonderful system. So what I'm leading to is that this has now become an industry. This is not just me and a couple of other guys or girls sort of putting it all together. This is something which is bigger than almost any one person, apart from Kevin and Robin.
But do you feel still that Kevin and Robin, the Underwoods, are yours in the end, or do they belong to the actors? I mean, how much of them are still, people you recognise as your creations?
Oh. I remember the first day I got a phone call. Hi, Mike. This is Joe, and we want to do your House of Cards in America. And in all honesty, I had that telephone conversation a dozen times before. Promises in Hollywood are very easy to make. Very often they're simply not kept.
Yeah.
And I was very blasé about the whole thing. And I said, fine, you come back when you're ready. And 6 months later, the phone rang again. Hi, Mike, it's Joe again, and we still want to do your House of Cards, and we've got we've got Kevin Spacey and David Fincher on board. What do you think? I said, I've got to think about this. This is a trick question, surely. What's to think about? Fincher, Spacey, gods of the big screen, wanting to do House of Cards? So I thought about it for about 0.3 of a nanosecond and said, yeah, you know, and expecting, in all honesty, expecting the traditional Hollywood treatment of being chewed up and spat out immediately. They were buying my house, and this is what you have to get used to. They are buying your house, and they will move you out, and we'll move in, and then they will get responsible for the redecoration, for knocking down, for putting up, everything. But no, they said, no, this is your house. You designed it, you conceived it, you built it, you've lived in it. We want you to be part of this. And we want you on board. And so, you know, I am an executive producer. And it has turned out, against all my expectations, to be the happiest professional experience of my life. But so I still feel huge ownership, and it does matter to them because we have quite a theatrical background to the whole thing. A lot of the actors aren't traditional television actors, they actually come from the theatre. And there is still that very happy feeling on set of, as you would get behind a theatre set rather than the traditional Hollywood set where it's all handbags at dawn. So I feel far more connected than I ever expected to. Is it my creation? It was my creation a long time ago, but this is now something that's grown. My baby has grown up, and it is no longer in my control. It is, if I fell under a bus tomorrow, it would still carry on. And in all honesty, I think the American version has done something which I wish I'd been brilliant enough to conceive of, because they have done. They've created not just Francis Urquhart, or Frank Underwood, rather, but they have created also Claire Underwood as an equal co-partner. And they have established a situation where you never know quite who's in charge. It's a wonderful two-hander. And that itself is driving the whole narrative along.
Absolutely.
And I have to tell you, it is much more brilliant than what I came up with just F.U. and his wife, who was important, but not on the same basis.
Absolutely. A little bit like Michael Gove and Sarah Vine, would you say? You couldn't possibly comment.
I couldn't possibly comment about that one. But, and I'm sure that the slip of the finger or the tongue or whatever it was that sent that email around was an entire... If I had put that in a book, nobody would have believed it, would they? Would they?
Oops, I did it again. It does happen. But Frank Underwood, Francis Urquhart, obviously characters in the end who were invented from whole cloth. At least I hope to God they were, otherwise we're in real trouble. What about when, as with some of your novels, you've taken someone who's right in the middle of our historical perception, Winston Churchill, and then you're taking one of the best-known characters in world history and you're fictionalizing him. I mean, do you find yourself thinking, what can I bring that's new to Winston Churchill?
I thought about that before I even started. And it's a really important question, because it's not, if they're to be of any value, and I was getting to the stage there, and I was beginning to think that I perhaps said a little bit about writing, and I wanted to test myself. I mean, I want to push the envelope a little bit, find a new challenge and see how I came up with it. Can a novelist bring anything to an historical character or an understanding of history and a period like Winston Churchill? Well, or should we leave it up to the historians? But of course, the historians don't get it right. They can't get it all right, even the good ones. And there are a lot of actually really second-rate historians out there too. And some historians that get it horribly wrong.
Do you want to name names, Michael?
No, I don't. But I remember when I went to, what historians do is they, if they're good, they gather up all the evidence out there and they bring it together and they analyse it and make judgments on it, and on that basis decide whether Churchill was good or great or fallible or weak or whatever. Novelists work from the other way round. We work from the inside out. So before I even started to deal with what he did in the historical record, I wanted to find out what that man was really like, what really turned him on, what got him out of bed in the morning, what did he feel, what did he fear, what really motivated him. And approaching it from a dramatic point of view, I began to get feelings about Winston Churchill that often very considerably changed my understanding of the historical facts that he went to do. And this is one of the things that all of my experience in politics tells me. It's not just what happens on the outside, at the front of the stage, in the lights that matters. It's actually what's going on behind stage in their personal lives, because believe it or not, politicians are human like the rest of us. And sometimes we go through appalling periods, sometimes we go through great periods, and it absolutely affects everything that we're doing. So I wanted to look at Churchill from the inside out. And for that purpose, we all know that Churchill is the 65-year-old man who came and saved us. World War II broke out, we called for Winston and we won. Very simple, wasn't it? Well, of course it's not. Nonsense like that. And I began to discover all the flaws in Winston and all the difficulties with Winston, which actually made me an even greater admirer of him, frankly. But in order to understand the old man, haven't you got to understand where he comes from? Haven't you got to understand the boy? So I went to Winston's first school, which is St George's in Ascot. It's now a very nice school for young ladies. In his day, it was a school for boys, 40 of them. Winston was the youngest. It was run by a beastly man called the Reverend Herbert Sneed Kinsley, who, strange man, he liked to take his boys down to the swimming pool, or swimming pond in those days. And we're talking about 1880 now, where he would take off all of his clothes, and he would instruct the boys to take off all of their clothes too, and then they would all jump into the swimming pond and splash around and have fun. He liked to be chased through the woods on paper chases by the boys. What am I telling you? What am I getting close to? I think that he was a man who shouldn't have been let within a million miles of impressionable young boys. He abused his boys physically, emotionally, intellectually, who knows, sexually. And Winston was one of them, the youngest. It was a trial of fire and brimstone for him. He was once beaten so badly that blood poured from the wounds on his body. And how did Winston Churchill respond? He was beaten so badly that he literally had to spend days in the sand recovering from these vicious wounds. The next time that he joined the school company, they were taken down to the swimming pond. Winston crept away, stole back up to the school, broke into the headmaster's office, and stole from the back of the door the headmaster's prized straw boater, which he used for formal occasions, assemblies, greeting parents. And Winston took that straw boater down to the school woods, and he spent one glorious afternoon kicking the crap out of it. Not bad for an 8-year-old boy who had just gone through what he had been through. Now, I think there is a connection between that 8-year-old boy, defiant, absolutely beyond anything that most of us could consider, and that 65-year-old man. And I think that was an insight which I found very rewarding. And I began to get an understanding of a boy and a man who was driven sometimes to the point of obsession and way beyond what most of us would put up with. So when I had finished, and I went to St George's to ask them if I could research this, I spent all day there with a great box of old bits of paper about Winston, photographs and things like that. And I said at the end of the day, thank you so much for your kindness. I'm sorry to have taken your time. You must get people like me bothering you every day of the week. And she said, we haven't had anybody for 10 years. I said, how many history books have been written about Winston over those 10 years? Hundreds and hundreds. And not all would necessarily have had any need to think about that, but none of them did. And so I think that in my researches as a novelist, I have been able to help add to the picture of Winston in a way which historians traditionally can't.
Michael, thank you for that. You've raised a lot more points in our discussion, and we've got a bit of time. What I'd like to do is collect some more questions. I might actually take 2 or 3 and then bring them back to you, just so that there's enough time for a bit of a go-round. So we've got mics, and we've got plenty of hands. Let's start over there, and then one there and one there, and then perhaps take one more after that, and then see where we are. And again, do tell us who you are and what your question is.
My name's Ryan, and although I don't sound like it, I'm actually one of Boris's constituents, or at least I was at the start of this talk. I'm just wondering, you've created in FU what I think can be described as an evil character. He certainly carries out a great many evil acts. You've been involved in the creation of another in Frank Underwood. Do you ever get a little bit worried when people approach you and talk about those characters admiringly, when they say, well, at least they can get things done, they know how to pursue their policies to get them effected? Does that ever concern you a little bit, that people look at them admiringly?
Okay, very clear question. Thanks for that. Let's take, I think we had a hand in the middle there. Yes, youngish looking gentleman there anyway. Let's get a mic to you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Dominic. I'm a project manager in London. I couldn't have actually picked a better question to follow because mine is very similar on that vein of getting things done. I wanted actually to turn to your own experience as a Chief of Staff in Parliament. Was that an idea in your mind that drove you, if you just got to get something done? And also, what advice would you give to anyone in a similar situation where in Parliament or elsewhere who's sitting surrounded by people who perhaps don't like each other or are dithering and you just want to get something done?
Career advice, no less. From the creator of Francis Urquhart. That could be worrying. Okay, let's take, was there a question on this side? Didn't want to miss anyone out here or not? Maybe not. Okay, anyone on this side and get one more in? No? Okay, yes? Yeah, sorry, right over there. Yeah, let's take yours and then we'll come back to Michael.
I wondered if, my name's Robbie, I'm a journalist. I'm wondering if you could give us some insight into these personal moments of triumph and defeat. How do you go about imagining what a character's feeling at those moments, which are so emotive in the TV and in the books? And what do you think Boris Johnson and Michael Gove might be feeling like today?
So actually some very good and connected questions. I suppose we start very briefly. The first question is whether or not you get worried when people come to you, if they do indeed, and say, well, you know, Underwood, Urquhart, horrible characters, but they get things done. And then in the middle, I think the last two questions are really about getting inside the heads of people. You're drawing on your own experience, drawing on your experience as someone who creates fiction. How do you think yourself inside these characters? And I think we have to end with that thought. And what do you think Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have going on inside their heads now? Michael.
It's interesting. I look at the American television scene, political drama. During the time of George W. Bush, it was the West Wing. During the time of Obama, it's House of Cards. Now, West Wing, of course, is filled with characters who are warm, cuddly, and doing the decent thing. Whereas, of course, Frank Underwood is the bastard who's getting things done. And I wonder whether, because these things always have a time of their own, a time and a place of their own, I wonder whether the West Wing was popular at that time because it contrasted with the reality of George W. Bush, or what people saw as the reality of George W. Bush, and whether the hard-nosed, get-things-done bastard Frank Underwood also contrasts very nicely with Barack Obama. And I just wonder whether there is an interplay of those things going on. But do I get worried about creating politicians like Frank Underwood who are such swine? Well, I tell you, the only people that I've upset, that I know I've upset in politics by writing books like that, are those politicians who've come up to me and said, you know, that Francis Urquhart, that's based on me, really, isn't it? and I have to tell them, look, sorry, no, it's not. They go away utterly crestfallen. And if I'd had £1 for every time a politician or a journalist had come up to me and say, next series, can I, little walk-on part, maybe in the back, something like that. If I had taken £1 every time that question had been asked of me, I would have doubled my income from the whole thing. So, I mean, we have to get a sense of perspective, and I hope a sense of humour at times about these things. But then we go on to the sort of terribly much deeper question about what are chiefs of staff there for? How do you, what do you decide to do? I remember being told, when I became chief of staff, I asked Norman Tebbit, I said, what is the job of a chief of staff? He said, well, lad, he said, there comes a time in every war where the situation requires that the generals want somebody to be taken out into a courtyard, put up against a wall and shot. He said, your job is to find those bodies. And if you can't, it is to be the body.
I didn't realise that Norman Tebbit was in fact Michael Caine.
You want to hear my cod Churchill?
No, we really don't. We really don't.
But being a chief of staff, it is to help the process of getting things done. And if you get things done in politics, particularly big things, it is bound to be difficult. It's bound to be controversial. No politician ever became great simply by sitting there and watching things happen in front of them. You become great by doing great things. So if you really want to become great, you have to go that extra mile. You have to be that extra bit tough, and sometimes it means being ruthless. And I make no apologies for this. Politics is not a pleasant game. They say it's the world's second oldest profession, which takes most of its rules from the first. And I have to tell you that after my experience in the referendum campaign, I believe it is actually the world's oldest profession and has no bloody rules at all.
And that does bring up the last question we have to ask you, Michael, which comes from there, which is over that side of the room. You know, what do you think is going on inside the heads of the key players, and I use that term players advisedly, right now?
What I want to know, and the honest answer is, of course, I don't know. I'm waiting. You know, as I was coming...
if you were writing them, what would
As I was on the bus this morning, every time I passed a bus stop, the headline had changed. You know, and dare I say that I was feeling slightly smug, because very early this morning, before I got on my bus, I'd come out in favour of Theresa May. So as the events today have unfolded, I'm thinking, actually, you know, perhaps it was a good thing to do at that time, rather than be jumping on what is rapidly becoming a bandwagon. But what I'm fascinated by, both as a politician and as a dramatist, and actually as a person, is I'm waiting to hear why those decisions were made. Were they matters of great political principle, or were they matters of great personal, excuse me, great personal emotion and hurt? Or was it a mixture of all two? I'm sorry. I have to tell you that in my experience, it's likely to be the latter, rather than the former.
The personal rather than the
personal rather than principled. Oh, wow. I don't normally do this. Ask a question while
take a sip of water, or a long swig of water, Michael, because I'll ask what I think will be our last question to finish us off. But it's a question for a novelist, but it is very much also about the politics which has been breaking out in such spectacular fashion over the last week, and certainly today. We've been talking a lot about narratives and the way in which fiction, novels, films, whatever, reflects a wider political reality. The 1980s, I think, was good that way, in that there were stories, not quite black and white, but certainly sides opposing each other that could be portrayed very effectively in fiction. I suspect that we may be moving into an era, possibly starting today, in which the narrative of British politics is going in directions we haven't seen before. As a novelist, as well as a politician, what do you see as the narrative possibilities, the likelihoods about the big, exciting stories we're going to tell ourselves as a nation, or perhaps a collection of nations, in the next 5, 10, 20 years? What's the next House of Cards, Folding Star, Titmus, you know, whatever, Boys from the Black Stuff? What's that narrative going to be?
I think politics have changed remarkably, and therefore political drama has changed remarkably. It was much easier during the 80s. During the 80s, I mean, this was before the end of the Cold War, politics were ideological. I use that term hesitatingly because ideology is supposed to be so appalling. Actually, what it means is people having views. And I'm actually in favour of politicians having views. Having their own views, sets of values around which they coalesce and defend and have thought through. Increasingly, since the wall came down, I think we've become much less ideological. Our parties have become much less based on values. We've become managerial.
Surely that's not a way of describing it without going into the sort of the party politics of it, but Brexiteering versus, Europeanism, that is an ideological divide of a sort.
I see people going backwards and forwards and saying I'm for or against. And they say, I'm getting dizzy. If they could attach a spring to it, it would drive a pretty large electricity generator the way they've gone backwards and forwards. But I think it's fair to say that the difference, the value difference between the parties simply isn't what it used to be. And that's true all the way around Europe. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why you're getting so many new parties coming in, because there's a gap that's opened up. And all the way around Europe, in a great flurry, in so many countries, you're getting new parties emerging. Podemos, Syriza, in Golden Dawn, Front National, and everywhere you look, you having this challenge. Whether the events that we're now living through is going to actually produce parties which go back to being more than just managerial, we'll do a better job of managing, but actually have different perspectives and different objectives, it's very possible.
And could that be the narrative, without being too crude, but the narrative of the interwar period again, the 20s and 30s, when strongly nationalist parties, as opposed to perhaps more cosmopolitan parties, were the face of part of that ideological divide?
Well, it's possible. It's absolutely possible. Remember, it happened often in the 1930s because of the failure of the establishment. And if the establishment fails again, and I go to Greece, where the establishment has utterly failed, yes, then you are getting the pressure from the extremes. You're getting, this is going way beyond that, I'm getting political now, but I'm getting passionate about it, because Greece suffered so much during the last war. And yet today, you have, every weekend in Athens, you have people marching around the streets of Athens, Golden Dawn, raising their fists in fascist salutes. This is something that we never, ever thought could possibly happen. And of course, I point the finger of accusation at them. But actually, I think we have to recognise that we, the establishment, have got it wrong. We've been blind. We have been too self-centred, perhaps wrapped up in too much of a cocoon, not understanding what's going on out there. So the challenge, it seems to me, and it's got wonderful dramatic possibilities too, is perhaps somebody who is going to try, who comes from the outside of the establishment, tries to shake up the establishment, and I think it certainly deserves and needs shaking up. But of course, the establishment will do all sorts of things to prevent this thoroughly decent, ordinary, motivated, wonderful man or woman. They'll try to destroy him.
Could be a woman?
It could be a woman. I've got this vision of the future. It's got Theresa May, it's got Frau Merkel, and it's got Mrs. Clinton. And the three of them, the three women dominating our world. Now, whether this is the great triumvirate or whether it's like the witches of Macbeth, Hubble, Bubble, Boil, and Trouble.
You do realise this is on the record, Michael.
I'm saying I don't know. But yes, the answer to your question, yeah, I don't think that the fact that there are women nowadays matters very much at all. It's not something. In Maggie Thatcher's day, of course, it mattered. It was extraordinary. She said herself that she couldn't imagine a woman getting into Downing Street. Nowadays, it just happens to be whoever happens to turn up at the right time. I hope that's the way anyway, because it means that we've grown up a bit.
And certainly no chance the next few years that we'll run out of stories, I think. Whatever they may be.
Even if we run out of ink to write them with.
No doubt. We have worked you hard, but we've had an absolutely splendidly stimulating evening. Everything from your own work to the wider questions of fiction and how it deals with politics to, I think, some pretty pointed reflections on the contemporary scene as well. It's been a huge pleasure, I think, for all of us. Would you please thank our speaker, Lord Dobbs, Michael Dobbs.
Thank you for joining us at the British Academy for this evening's event. Visit our website, britac.ac.uk, to catch up on events you might have missed in the With Great Power season.